Today we will have Dr. Todd Lawson, Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto, begin his series of talks on the Gayom al-Asma, the first work revealed by the Bab. And today his title is his Artistry, his Audience, and his Commentary on the Surah of Joseph. Now turning to Todd himself, as you can see, he has been a Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto in Islamic Thought, a Baha'i since 1968, and a member of the Association for Baha'i Studies since its very beginning. I can remember first meeting Todd in a pizza restaurant late at night in Ottawa in 1980, I believe it was. I walked in and there he was, so we ended up sitting down and talking over pasta, if I remember right. That was the first time we met. He has published quite a lot on the Gayom al-Asma. His book, Gnostic Apocalypse in Islam and Islam, Rutledge 2012, for example, was about the Gayom al-Asma, and he's published numerous other articles and books on the relationship between the Baha'i faith and Islam, on Quran commentary, Sufism, and Shiism. The most recent book that I have listed here, maybe you've had something more recent, Todd, I apologize if this isn't the latest, is Intimacy and Ecstasy in the Quran, in Quran commentary, which is a study of the Bab's earliest major work. And there's more information about that here at this link published by Brill. Todd lives in Montreal with his wife, Barbara, but is currently enjoying the weather in Europe. And at that, I will switch over to Todd. Welcome, Todd. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation today on the Gayom al-Asma.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for those words. I am very happy and honored to be a part of your program, which is so valuable and so important. All the hard work that you and your colleagues do has given so much to the Baha'i community. We can't imagine what things would be like had Will Institute not existed, and we don't want to try. So I'm very grateful to you and glad that you've asked me to participate. And I wish I could see the people who are participating in the webinar. But I will try and imagine a friendly crowd out there. I know most people, I've seen the comments coming in for the past couple of days, the introductions and so on. And it's very exciting to have such a group of people who are so interested in the writings of the Bab in general. Now, I would like to point out in the first couple of minutes that the Gayom al-Asma is thought of as the first work of revelation of the Bab because it is the first work that was composed by him after his announcement to Mullah Hussein that he was the promised one. But it is not the first major work composed by the Bab. He had written numerous works of Shi'i mystical thought prior to May 22nd, 1844. And one of them was a very long and elaborate Quran commentary on the first two surahs of the Quran. And this is the work that I have published the most recent book on, which came out in December 2018. It's unfortunately criminally overpriced. I wouldn't suggest anybody actually buy it, but if it comes to a library near you, you might find it interesting to read. These publishers charge a fortune for these things, and it's really sort of discouraging to see that one's work has to be packaged that way and sent out that way at such a high price. In any case, this earlier work, even though the Gayom al-Asma is the first official work of revelation, shall we say, of the Bab as the Bab when he was claiming to be the Bab. There are many hints and suggestions in this earlier work that he already knew who he was. And it is very interesting to compare that earlier work with his later work. The earlier work was begun as in homage to Sayyid Kazem Rashti, who the Bab refers to in the opening part of that earlier work, the tafsir on the Surah of the Cow, as his beloved teacher. And he says that he began the work after a vision in which he saw the entire Holy Land rise up and travel from Karbala, which is what is meant by the words Holy Land, to before his house in Shiraz, and bit by bit rematerialize with the information that that Sayyid Kazem was dying or had died. And so he began the work on the tafsirs of the Surah of the Cow at that time in homage to his beloved teacher. And I think in line with Islamic traditional Quranic science, he had, although he didn't say this, but I think he had in mind at that time to write a complete commentary on the Quran from throughout all 114 surahs from the very beginning until the end. This was a common practice amongst religious scholars and mystics and philosophers in Islam in order to demonstrate their particular ideas and to demonstrate their mastery over the texts and the hadith and so forth. I believe that the Bab had it in his mind at this time, desire to, in proper homage to Sayyid Kazem, to produce an entire Quran commentary. An entire Quran commentary is typically runs to about 30 volumes from beginning to end. Can be shorter, can be longer, but this is the kind of work we're talking about that he may have planned to do. This plan was shortly interrupted by a number of events, chief among them being another spiritual vision, dream or vision. The word in Arabic and Persian is the same, in which he encountered the severed head of the Imam Hussein and imbibed or drank 7 drops of blood from this severed head. I know it does not speak to us in the West. This is a somewhat gory picture. We're not used to this kind of thing in our own religiosity, but in the context, the cultural context of the Bab, there could be no greater or higher honor for a believer than to have such an encounter. The Bab tells us in 2 places, and maybe more, but 2 that I know of, that this vision, this experience, which seems to have occurred shortly after he began writing that earlier commentary, which he started in January of 1844. This vision occurred probably in April or early May, seems to be a feasible date. And he tells us that it was as a result of this vision and of drinking with great joy and great love these 7 drops of blood that the Bab felt himself endowed with a new power of composition, of writing prayers and commentaries and texts and contemplations. It was just after this that he began the work that is the topic of our discussion today. The tafsir on the chapter of Joseph in the Quran, or it's also called the best of stories, or the tafsir of the best of stories, because the Surah 12 in the Quran, the Surah of Joseph, calls itself the best of stories. Now, explain that in a second. The title that is most well known by as the Bab's composition in commentary on the 12th surah of the Quran is Qayyum al-Asma, which is a little difficult to translate literally, but what it means is it means he who is beyond all names and attributes. So it's a reference to the utterly transcendent God. The interesting thing here is that the word Qayyum is also chosen by the Bab because it has the same numerical value as the word Joseph in Arabic. So this is a very good example of the way in which the Bab combined and connected perhaps what might have otherwise been thought disconnected texts and ideas in the holy works of Islam to talk about something new. So I think that we can now move on to the main talk, which is to discuss in very broad terms the artistry of this Qayyum al-Asma, the Tafsir Surat Yusuf, or the commentary on the story of Joseph in the Quran. And I'm concentrating on its artistic dimension for a couple of reasons. Number one, we know that the work itself is responsible for the birth of the Babi dispensation, that it was the response of Mullah Hussein, about which we will talk more in the third installment, and it was the work that convinced these young students. They were sort of like senior graduate students and young assistant professors, if you like, that had come out of the seminaries in Karbala, who were looking for the promised one in expectation of the return of the hidden Imam, because it was now 1,000 years since the disappearance, and as you all know, Sayyid Kazem, before he passed away, had instructed his followers to look for the return, which was near at hand, instead of doing what they were asking him about, which was, who is going to be the leader of our group after you are gone? So rather than appoint someone to be the leader of the Shaykhi group, he said it's now time to wait for and look for the hidden Imam. The young men who came to Shiraz on that fateful evening were all highly educated, highly sophisticated, deeply learned scholars of Islam, which included being scholars of philosophy, scholars of Islamic history, sometimes alchemy, sometimes natural science. They were highly educated people. And they were utterly overwhelmed by this work that the Bab began composing on the night of the 22nd of May in 1844. They were impressed profoundly and eternally. It changed their lives. So the approach that we're taking tonight and talking about this, you might think of as being along the lines of trying to understand what it was that came from this young, virtually unknown merchant, not highly educated citizen of Shiraz. What was it in the nature of this work that impressed these highly, skeptical academic types albeit spiritually educated as well, but they were if you like, cocky graduate students who were out looking for the promised one. We know that they were very sure of themselves because of that beautiful passage in Nabil. When you recall, we'll talk about it more later, you recall that Mullah Hussein is sitting in the house of the Bab on that evening, and the Bab is asking him what he's doing, and Shirazi says, well, I'm looking for the promised one. The Bab said, well, how will you know when you find the promised one? And Mullah Hussein says, well, there are several attributes that we've seen in the sacred traditions, and our teachers told us he'll be younger than 30 and older than 20. He will not smoke. He will be very beautiful. He will be of the lineage of the Sayyids, or a descendant of the Prophet. And then the Bab interrupts him and says, well, I have all of these attributes. And we get an idea of how these young men were thinking about things. That when Mullah says, thinks to himself. It tells us in the Nabil. He thinks to himself, I couldn't believe the presumption of my host, words to that effect. This young, unknown, unschooled person claims to be the focus of all the love and authority in the universe. And frankly, no one's ever heard of him before, and he hasn't thoughts along these lines. He hasn't published anything, shall we say. He hasn't taught in any madrasa. How can he make such a claim, such arrogance? It was while he was having these thoughts that the Bab made this astonishing announcement. And in order to understand the astonishing nature of that announcement, I have to digress again. I hope I'm coming across okay and not too scattered. But before Sayyid Kazim died, we're told in Nabil that his students approached him to ask him precisely about the story of Joseph in the Quran. And they approached him and asked him to write a commentary on the Surah of Joseph, in line with the teachings of the Shaykhi school and the expectation of the return of the hidden Imam and these things, because this is what the Shaykhi school was all about. Certain new approach to the notion of the return of the hidden Imam. Quite a radical departure from the traditional Shi'i approach. And Sayyid Kazem said, well, it's simply beyond me. I can't do it. I cannot write this for you. And for him to say such a thing is also pretty impressive, because he wrote numerous books of the most intricate type of thought and expression that you could imagine. Quite remarkable. You all should start studying the works of the Shaykhis so that we can put it together more clearly for ourselves and for the people who are not Baha'is, what their great achievement was. We need workers in this particular area who will dedicate their lives to learning Persian and Arabic and reading these very interesting and sometimes difficult texts, so that we can appreciate the career and the life of the Letters of the Living and the Bab more perfectly. Anyway, he said, I cannot compose a commentary on the Surah of Joseph. It's beyond me. But when the promised one appears, he will unasked produce such a commentary. The word for commentary in Arabic is tafsir. He will produce such a tafsir. Okay, this information is essential. So we have Mullah Hussein in the house of the Bab, and we have the Bab saying, well, I have all of these attributes. I'm younger than 30 and older than 20. I'm related. I'm a descendant of the Prophet. I don't smoke. I'm and so on. And Mullah saying, can you believe the ego on this person? You know, and just as he's having these somewhat negative, astonished thoughts, the Bab says, and now it is time to reveal the commentary on the Surah of Joseph. So this gets Mullah Hussein's attention, to say the very least. So this is the background for this work. And what we want to understand is how it affected these hardball type academic young mullahs and scholars that are fresh out of graduate school, shall we say, and looking for the hidden imam. How can we tell what they had in their minds in addition to what they read in the hadith and so on about what the hidden imam would look like and what he would produce? So that's the question we're trying to ask. What affected them? And I will tell you right now that what affected them was not a series of new laws or even new information. Everything that's in the Qayyum al-Asma is quite familiar to learned Muslims, people who know the Quran. There's no new information. What there is a new approach to the Quran, which was absolutely unpredictable. It could not have been imagined. The Bab put the Quran together in a completely new way based on the story of Joseph. In order to understand how new this composition is, and you can put it in the bank that this work is completely unprecedented. There is nothing like it in the history of Arabic literature. It's all written in Arabic, by the way. There is nothing produced like it before or since. It stands completely alone in the history of Arabic letters. But it doesn't bring out a new system. This comes later. It doesn't give new laws. The laws that it enunciates are the laws that everyone's already familiar with. The laws that are in the Quran and in the Hadith. So what was it that captured their hearts and their souls so profoundly? And the short answer that I would like to present you with and propose to you this evening or this afternoon is that it was its artistic intricacy and power. And we will try and communicate what that means in the rest of the time that we have here today. I would like now to show the slide. So in order to introduce the topic of the artistry of the Qayyum al-Asma, I'd like to begin with another work composed by the Bab, which is this star shape in the main picture here, which is talisman, repeating the divine attributes, and in the form of a prayer, but in the form of this five-pointed star, which is a symbol in the Bab's language and context of the of humanity, of mankind, of a human being. It's in anthropoid shape. The star is all done by him, written in this beautiful script that looks like it's, it looks like it's a flame, doesn't it? In this very powerful, beautiful, graceful script. I want you to see this because, in fact, even though the text of the Qayyum al-Asma is not in this shape at all, from the point of view of the arrangement of, if you like, ideas and sacred scripture and words and the attributes of God, it in fact comes through as representing a sculpture or music of ideas that might be compared to this. The Bab's artistic nature comes through perfectly in this work of his, and he did many works along these lines throughout his life in this gorgeous, beautiful handwriting that he had, and his artistic sensibility is very, very evident. Another work, wait a second. I want to go to the next slide. Let's see what happens. This one is another work of the Bab's, and a traditional Islamic talismanic device, but this is one composed by the Bab, which shows again his concern with proportion, rhythm, harmony, the use of space, the beautiful, graceful handwriting again. We can look at the text of the Qayyum al-Asma, which I did not, of course, bring a picture of because I'm still learning how to do these things. Forgive me. But we see that in the Qayyum al-Asma, even though it is not a work of graphic art, it is a work of literary art, if you like. And it is this artistic power, this ability to control the resources of the sources that he depended upon and to rearrange those texts in a compelling way that simply overwhelmed the letters of the living and caused them to devote their lives and to teach the new vision and the new revelation throughout Iran, and which ultimately led, of course, to the rise and appearance of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. So what I'm suggesting is that the original revelation, the original dispensation beginning was an artistic gesture rather than a theological gesture, if you like. It was an aesthetic work rather than a discursive work. Even though there was discourse involved, there was the Quran and there were the Hadith, and the Bab's mastery of them and control of them was extremely impressive. It was actually the way they came through his mind and through his pen that caused the first Mullah Hussein and the Letters of the Living to devote themselves to him and to know without any doubt at all that the hidden Imam was either there now or was very soon to be there. And in any case, it was a reality. The return of the hidden Imam was a living reality because of the compelling artistry of the Bab. Now, how do we get it? It's relatively straightforward to notice and appreciate the art involved in these works of the Bab, this mandala-like text and the star text here. We see it. We don't need to argue that art is involved and control of materials and sense of proportion, and rhythm and harmony, and all of these elements of art, rather than theology or philosophy or even mystical ideas. It's the compelling power of the experience of these beautiful emblems, talismans, and mandalas that speak for themselves. I mean, it is interesting to see what they actually say also, but that which draws the person in is not the idea, but the artistic perfection of the works themselves. Now, in order to appreciate the artistic achievement of the Qayyum al-Asma, which is, again, a commentary on the 12th surah of the Quran, the Surah of Joseph, then we need to know what the Surah of Joseph is all about. Otherwise, it doesn't really make much sense to think of a commentary on it. The Surah of Joseph is in the Quran, has a very special place. Unlike all of the other surahs of the Quran, the 113 other surahs, the Surah of Joseph has a clear beginning, middle, and end. And it tells the epic story of the love of Jacob for his son Joseph, the exile and banishment of Joseph due to the jealousy and betrayal of his brothers, the languishing of Jacob in heartbreak all the years that Joseph was away in Egypt, the injustice that was visited upon Joseph by the official of the Egyptian courts for whom Joseph worked, and you could say was adopted by these high-ranking officials, in whose house he was abused by his new adoptive mother, who tried to seduce him because he was so beautiful and handsome. As a result of which, even though everyone knew he was innocent, he was put into prison anyway because he was a Hebrew slave. And in prison, he revealed to his fellow prisoners that through conversation and their time together, he revealed that he had very serious ability in the interpretation of dreams. And as you know, eventually the Pharaoh had these, who at this stage didn't know anything about Joseph, had these very puzzling dreams that he tried to get answers for from his own court theologians, all of whom unanimously said these dreams are just nonsense. They don't mean anything. Don't worry yourself about them. They were the famous dreams of the 7 starving cattle and the 7 fat cattle and so on. And no one could make head or tail of them. One of Joseph's fellow prisoners had by now been released and mentioned to the Pharaoh that, in fact, there was probably somebody who could interpret these dreams for him. And this was a man named Joseph, a Hebrew slave in prison. Pharaoh called him out of prison to interpret the dreams. You know, Joseph gave a very persuasive interpretation of the dreams. Joseph was then appointed as chief over agriculture of all of Egypt and became responsible for the distribution of grain. At the same time, his unfaithful brothers had been sent by Jacob, who was languishing sightless in Canaan land because they'd been hit with a terrible famine. He sent the brothers down to Egypt for aid, to ask for grain, to tide them over. And who do they encounter? Unbeknownst to them, lo and behold, they encounter Joseph, the one they sold into slavery to begin with. So Joseph is there. He recognizes his brothers. The brothers don't recognize him for some time. Ultimately, I'll skip ahead a little bit, as I warmly suggest that everybody study this story because it represents the beginning of the Baha'i faith, especially the Bab's interpretation of it, and his rearrangement of it in the Qayyim al-Asma, and as you know, the many, many references to Joseph in Baha'u'llah's writings. So Joseph is a central figure. So what happens ultimately is that there's this moment of recognition when the brothers realize that they have been asking their brother Joseph, who they sent into Egypt land because of their jealousy of him, because he was beautiful and he was his father's favorite and so on. father had given him this expensive coat, many colors and so on. Joseph said, okay, I will forgive you, which is a very important thing. And I would like you to go back to our home in Canaan land and bring everyone back down here to Egypt to live with me in comfort for the rest of their lives. And he said, oh, and by the way, when you do return, take this shirt of mine, this coat of many colors, however way you wish to think of it, and take it and lay it upon my father's face, and he will return, his eyesight will return to him, and so on. And then there's a very important scene in the Quran when brothers are leaving Joseph, leaving Egypt, going across the border. As soon as they cross the border between Egypt, Canaan land, there's this cutaway scene, like it was a movie of some kind. Jacob, in his tents out in his pastoral lands, raises up and says, I detect the breath of Joseph, or the scent of Joseph. It's a very beautiful scene because the brothers had with them the shirt of Joseph, and it shows the intense love of Jacob and Joseph. They get back to their home. They lay the shirt on his eyes. His eyesight is recovered. Recall, Jacob lost his eyesight because he wept so intensely that he wept the color, which is the symbol of sight, out of his eyes. His eyes became white from weeping, which means that he washed away through his grief his sense of sight, his grief about the separation and loss of his son Joseph and Joseph's brother, ultimately Benjamin. So they all return to Egypt and live in knowledge of God's plan for the children of Israel and for revelation and for the future of humanity. So humanity is reunited, you might say, through the love of Jacob and Joseph and the forgiveness of Joseph of his brothers. This is the huge message in the center of the story of Joseph. This is an unusual characteristic of the prophets that are talked about in the Quran, this idea of forgiveness. And as you know, that Joseph actually becomes a kind of typological prefiguration, not only for the Bab and Baha'u'llah, but earlier what functioned as such for Jesus himself in the commentary literature. So Joseph's power of forgiveness and love is rearranged by the Bab to be the center of focus for the entire Quran. Because I mentioned earlier that I think that the Bab had decided to compose a traditional commentary on the entire Quran from beginning to end. I think that in the process of this plan, he had this vision of the Imam Hussein, and as a result of that mystical vision was given new powers of composition and, if you like, revelation. And rather than comment in the traditional fashion on the Quran from one verse at a time, he rearranged things so that it occurred that the centerpiece message of the entire Quran is the story of Joseph. And why do we know that? Because in the process of writing that work, which is arranged in 111 chapters, each chapter with 42 verses, almost every other passage of the Quran, important part of the Quran, is employed in retelling the story of Joseph. And the Bab demonstrates his mastery of the text by taking verses from one end of the Quran and combining them with verses from another end of the Quran, completely unpredicted, and bringing them together so that they create a new music and a new rhythm and a new focus where the central teaching, as I said, becomes Joseph's beauty, which is one of the things he's also known for. The Prophet Muhammad said, God created beauty in 100 parts and gave 99 to Joseph. This is Joseph's role in the Islamic tradition. But this beauty also means his spiritual beauty and his ability to forgive his very evil brothers. This is a symbol in the Bab's context for the forgiveness of Sunni Muslims and Shi'i Muslims together. They must reunite as the brothers of Joseph did, in order that a greater unity might be achieved. The idea of the reunion of Jacob and Joseph is represented in this beautiful, this miniature from a 15th century book on the stories of the prophet. Jacob and Joseph surrounded by their brothers, the brothers and sons, meeting again in Egypt to reunite and carry on God's connection with the world. It is interesting that we might also think of this, the Bab and Baha'u'llah, as a new Joseph, a return of Joseph, coming to reunite or to heal the world which is languishing blindly and ill on something of a deathbed until it hears the new message. It's an artistic gesture of the highest magnitude and power, and it is what I think compelled, even though I've talked about it rather inadequately, and we haven't gone into the depth that is necessary. We can see where we need to go to explore this further. Jacob and Joseph's reunion are also represented in the Qayyum al-Asma, in this text written by the Bab, in the following way. The original text of the Quran you may see as standing for Jacob himself. And the new commentary proposed by the Bab, the new arrangement, represents in literary form the return of Jacob, the reunion of Jacob and Joseph. The commentary in the text and the original text are virtually indistinguishable. They are so close together. Reading the text, you cannot always tell where the commentary begins and ends, and where the original text begins and ends, much like this picture here with Jacob and Joseph. I think I will now stop talking and listen for your own comments and questions, and hope that at least some clarity came through and you were able to follow this discussion. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thanks, Todd. It's fascinating to hear all this and to see these pictures. I think that it really captures the account. And I guess we're looking forward to hearing more about how the Qayyum al-Asma does this as we go through subsequent the subsequent talks. Let me see if I can find the questions and answers. We don't have any yet. One thing that you had said that struck me, and I was actually reading something Mujan Momen wrote a year or two ago, and he compared the moment when the Bab had this vision of the severed head of Mullah Hussein to the moment in the Siyah Chal when Baha'u'llah saw the Maid of Heaven, and that the declaration of the Bab in Shiraz to Mullah Hussein is compared to the Rezvan event. In both of those declaration cases, the revelation began earlier, and there was a moment of symbolic beginning of the receipt of revelation. And so Mujan was speculating that it was this vision of the head of Mullah Hussein that was equivalent to the Siyah Chal event.
Yes, I think that's very compelling. I think it's quite useful to think of it that way. It seems to be the case, and we know that we've all scratched our heads when we read in Nabil and the Dawnbreakers that the time of the beginning of the revelation is fixed at 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset on the 22nd, 23rd of May in 1844, and we all wonder, what can this possibly mean? 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset. This simultaneously tells us too much and not enough. Seems like a very, anomalous detail. But my sense is that 2 hours and 11 minutes represents the moment, the astronomical moment, which the truth of the Bab's claim penetrated the heart of Mullah Hussein. And the Bab has tuned it. We know that Baha'u'llah said, Mullah Hussein is he without whom God would not have ascended to his throne. And we know that Baha'u'llah thought of the Qayyum al-Asma as the first, the greatest, and the most mighty book. And it's ambiguous whether he means of the Bab or of all books of all time in the Kitab-e-Iqan. So we get a sense of the momentousness of this text from those words from Baha'u'llah, and the sense of precision, anomalous precision that the Bab underlines in his 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset. And I think Mujan's suggestion is a very interesting and useful one. We do. It would represent a kind of symmetry with the way in which the dove comes to Jesus and the maid of heaven. But he had this image also of Sayyid Kazim's house in Karbala, the entire Holy Land, floating through the air and landing, as it were, piece by piece, sort of like a pixelated cinematic event before his house, announcing to him the passing of Sayyid Kazim. There seems to be also some messianic energy in this as well.
Yeah, and presumably in those days, the material means for moving the news from Karbala to Shiraz that Sayyid Kazim al-Rashidi had passed away would have been pretty slow. I mean, I rather doubt if he passed away on January 1st or December 31st, 1843-44, I think we're not quite sure which date.
That's right.
It would have taken a month for the news to get to Shiraz.
It could well have. Yeah. It's true.
It seems to me you had done some work on the tafsir on the Surat al-Baqarah, and he had started writing this surah before the vision of the head of Mullah Hussein.
As far as we know, yes.
Is there a difference of tone?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to you for asking this question.
Well, you had said there was a difference of tone in something you wrote, so that's why I asked.
The two works, these two works, the commentary on the Surat al-Baqarah, which was written before the Qayyum al-Asma, and the Qayyum al-Asma are two works of Quran commentary. Both of them are entitled Quran commentary. Tafsir is the technical term. Could not be more different. And you could not imagine two works that are more different in every possible way. The Tafsir Surat al-Baqarah, the earlier one, is much more traditional in form and content, and compositional, the style, the literary style. The Qayyum al-Asma is utterly, even though it deploys and uses and reworks the Quran. In fact, probably 80% of the vocabulary is the Quran, if not more, in the Qayyum al-Asma. There's very little of his own words as such. He makes his point by rearranging the Quranic words. It is done in such a way that it helps us understand a very important Baha'i technical term, which is badi. We have this word badi, B-A-D-I with an accent and the little raised C at the end, badi. This is a work that was used to refer to our calendar, the badi calendar, and the badi dispensation, and so on. It is a word that comes from the Quran originally. It derives from another divine name, which means wondrously new. This is the way we should understand this word, badi. And what is wondrous about it? It is wondrously new because it is simultaneously infinitely ancient. This is what it means. And even though we have the Quran here, which is divine revelation from the Kitab, from the mother book, straight down to the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be God's blessing and peace. It is arranged in such a way that it defies one's ability to account for, and makes beautiful, elegant, compelling sense, both the music of its Arabic and the discursive quality of its expression. It's unbelievable. So it is both spectacularly new and as old as the universe. This is the point of Badir. Yeah.
And the Qayyum al-Asma, does it do letter by letter commentary, whereas the Surah al-Baqarah doesn't? It doesn't either.
No, Surah al-Baqarah does a bit, but even there, not so much. Later on in the tafsir on the Surah al-Kawthar and the Surah Wal-As, other lengthy Quran commentaries written by the Bab on two of the smallest surahs in the Quran, that letter commentary comes into it much more. Yeah.
Interesting. So that's not the thing about the Qayyum al-Asma.
No, not at all. This is not what blew their minds. What blew their minds was the Bab's complete mastery of the Quran. It's as if he had here's a way to think about it. The Bab, the Qayyum al-Asma is like a piano with, how many verses are there in the Quran? 6,000 plus. With a piano with 6,000 keys, and the Bab is playing these keys in front of Mullah Hussein in a way that just baffles the mind. You know that in the Islamic mystical tradition, each prophet is given a particular spiritual vocation. Joseph is given the role of being a manifestation of the sacred imagination. And it's this imagination that allows him to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh, to imagine a world without retribution and revenge in dealing with his brothers, and to imagine the reunion of his fractured community. It is a very, very powerful thing. In Islamic metaphysical thought, the imagination is what is responsible for the creation of the cosmos, the divine imagination. So we see this communicated through, by virtue of being related to the prophet as a Sayyid, the Bab is also related to the historical Joseph. So we see this, the DNA of Joseph coming down through the generations, containing this imaginative component coming through and being expressed by the Bab in this work of art. You know, religion and art share a great deal. This has been talked about at great length by scholars and philosophers for generations, because they both represent ways of articulating, representing, and expressing the truth. They do it in a different way. Religious texts do it in a discursive way, a syllogistic way, a seriatim way, one thing after another. This is that, therefore that, and this, and so on, and follow this. But the artistic aspect of the religious texts comes into play when these sacred mythic forms, such as exile and return and reunion and trial and tribulation and the heroism of the prophets, are emphasized. This becomes part of a new artistic recital, combined with the way in which the Bab demonstrated that he had complete mastery over the Quran. He must have had it backwards and forwards. He could not have written the Qayyum al-Asma otherwise. You know, there's a debate about how long it took him to write it. He himself says it took 40 days. And the controversy arose, well, was it 40 consecutive days, or was it 40 days over a number of months, or was 40 just a symbol for completion and totality, which it is, of course, in mythic language, 40 days in the desert and so forth, 40 years in the desert and so on, represent a cycle of completion. Well, in my opinion, if the Bab, if a normal person had been given 40 years, they could not have composed the Qayyum al-Asma. So intricate it is, so mind-blowingly constructed. You know, when the unsympathetic people first read the Qayyum al-Asma, they said it's a mess. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's just a jumble, like the pharaohs who spoke about the jumbled dreams, right? Even up to E.G. Brown, he said the Qayyum al-Asma, as sympathetic as he was, said it's at times it's an unintelligible rhapsody. It doesn't make, but it makes absolute sense. There is no doubt about it. The sense is from beginning to end. It's just done in such a surprising way, a shocking way, in the way that Ulysses, for example, shocked its first audience, because Ulysses was a rewriting of the Odyssey, right? And Joyce put it together in a completely different way, which he was very sure of. He had no doubt at all. But its original reception was every bit as critical and vehement as was the reception of the Bab. The difference, of course, that Joyce eventually won over the audience, started literary modernism in the West, and became very prominent and celebrated, and probably even to some degree wealthy. The Bab was executed for a similar, if you like, literary gesture.
Fascinating. Well, we have a bunch of questions now.
Okay.
I'm not sure even where to start, actually. Giti says, what's the significance of Joseph in the Jewish tradition, and do they expect him to come back in any form? Is he considered a prophet?
That's a great question. A couple of years ago, I shared the podium with Robert Alter, who was foremost scholar of the Hebrew Bible, and we were both talking about Joseph. He was talking about Joseph from the Hebrew Bible tradition, and I was talking about it from the Quranic. I didn't talk about the Bab or Baha'u'llah. I spoke about the Quranic thing. When I was done, Alter, who is highly regarded, I mean, he's just published a new translation of the Hebrew Bible. It just came out in December, the entire thing. He's about 80 years old now, but he shook the world 40 years ago with his Art of Biblical Narrative. It was a very big book in religious studies. He said, this Joseph in the Quran is we don't have this kind of religious figure in the Hebrew Bible. Oh, it's he's venerated, of course, by the tradition, but we don't have the religious elements that come through in the Quran. So the Quran is teaching us a new way to think about Joseph, and a new role for him in society.
A resacralization.
Well, that's it. And the Bab's Qayyum al-Asma, you may think of as a re-revelation of the Quran, with the focus put where it should be: forgiveness, love, and unity, and beauty, and scent. This is an assignment for the class. When you're reading the writings of Baha'u'llah, keep track of every time you see the word beauty, a reference to a shirt or a garment, and a reference to what did I say? Scent, beauty,
Garment.
garment. Yeah, those three things you can think of as metaphors or symbols of the story and life and heroism of Joseph. The Baha'i faith, it's everywhere once you start looking for it.
It's very Josephian.
The hem of the garment, the scent of knowledge, the perfume of knowledge, on and on and on. You could write a book on this.
Sounds like
this is Joseph at the center of the Baha'i revelation.
Well, Runa asks this question: where can she find a complete copy of the Qayyum al-Asma in the original Arabic?
Oh, all over. You can download one from H Baha'i. You can get copies of it at Cambridge, and they have the Brown collection online. You can go there and download a copy in a beautiful Nastaliq hand. You can at the British Museum, at the Princeton Library. I think it's online at Princeton now. They have manuscripts. They're all manuscripts. Oh, but there is also a printed version which published in Damascus about 10 years ago. Omid was, when he was, Omid Ghaim Maqami was in Damascus, in the souk, in the market, and saw a printed copy of Qayyum al-Asma there. And that's, you can also find online. There are, if you want, I'll send you a copy if you want to send it around to people in the Arabic. I mean, I don't think it's a critical edition or anything, so there's likely to be some errors and so on in it, but it will give you an idea of how it flows. Tamara
asks, my question, will we be able to see some of the literary artistry through this series, or is Arabic a requirement in order to understand the literary side? I would like to know much more about how the Bab's commentary on the Surah of Joseph relates to the beginnings of the Baha'i faith.
Yes, wonderful. Well, I'm going to do what I can to communicate this to us in the next couple of meetings. There are some articles that have been written on this. I can send them your way, and people can download them and look at them. It is the unswervable truth is as follows: you cannot get a sense of this personally without knowing Arabic, unfortunately, because there are some attempts at translating this aspect of the Qayyum al-Asma, but they fail miserably, even though very talented people have made the attempt to make these translations. They fail because the music of Arabic is so different than the music of English. And the syntax and morphology of Arabic is utterly different. The grammar is different. So the way the language functions is utterly different. So to try and communicate the Arabic poetics of the Bab's Qayyum al-Asma in an English translation is an exercise in heartbreaking futility. You can get some of it across, and hopefully enough to encourage people to learn Arabic and do it, and to keep working on it so that we can actually one day maybe produce something like an English translation of the Qayyum al-Asma. The more people that work on it, the better chance we have of doing it. As you know, though, Robert Frost is famous for having said, "Poetry is that which is lost in translation." Right? So it may be utterly hopeless, but we can talk about it as long as you like, because it is a very thrilling and exciting thing. And I hope that you do get some idea of the great achievement of the Bab here. Young man, 24, 25 years old, clearly had complete mastery over the entire Quran text from beginning to end, and reconfigured it in dazzling badi fashion. Yes. And if we can't feel it personally, what we can do personally is to get a better idea of what it was that caused these letters of the living to lay down their lives for the Bob.
One thing I saw, I think it's Steve Lambden's translation of the first Súrih of the Bible, and
Right.
he put in boldface all the Quranic text. And I didn't actually try to read his translation, but I was struck by the fact that like 1/3 or 1/4 of the text was Quranic.
No, it's more than that, Rob.
Even more. Wow.
That might have been. I've done a text like that. Maybe you saw mine.
Maybe it was yours. Yeah.
It's much more. It's 90%.
That's amazing because clearly he's not using it in the same order.
That's the point.
That's what does it.
It's like it. Well, I've used this metaphor before. It is like improvisational music. In the United States, we call it jazz. Elsewhere, they call it something else. Where you take an existing melody or an existing chord structure and rearrange those tonalities, those rhythms, so that they still communicate with each other. They don't lose their identity, but they become something new. This is precisely what the Bab does in the Qayyum al-Asma. This is precisely what overwhelmed his first audience. Yeah. I can send you some texts for this. It's easier, in some ways, easier to talk about than to read. You'll see what I.
Yeah, well, I think it's your translation with all of the Quranic text in bold. Yeah. We'll be sure to add that to the course so that people can see it, because that will give them a visual expression of what you're talking about.
In the book that was recently published, which no one should purchase because it costs too much, I in fact convinced the publisher to put the Quran in green and to have the Bob's words in normal typeface. But that's not the Qayyum al-Asma. That's the Tafsir on Baqarah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Bahanur says, sometimes it is said that the Quran is not in a logical order. You said the Bab connects the different verses with each other in unheard of ways. Is the Bab maybe rearranging the Quran in a way that makes it more understandable?
No, not in our usual notion of what understanding means. The Bab is rearranging the Quran first to revolve around the new Joseph, which is the return of the hidden Imam in his immediate audience. Remember, Joseph was hidden in a well. So in Shi'i tradition, the hidden Imam has been compared to Joseph over the centuries because he comes out of the well, out of hiding, to come back into the world and has to fight a kind of a holy struggle with the Egyptians and finally emerge triumphant. This is what the Bab is telling us, but the way the Qayyum al-Asma is arranged is not more logical than the Quran. You can trust me on this. It is, and this is what caused some of its early unsympathetic readers to say that it was all nonsense, because they simply didn't get it. Mm-hmm. Didn't want to get it. They didn't want to see that the Bab was this magnificent artist and musician of religious ideas. They wanted to shut down this new movement that was very threatening.
Michael asks this. He says, I've been told that the grammar of the Quran is irregular when compared to standard Arabic, but that the Bab was able to both speak and write in the same manner. I think he means as the Quran. He was somehow able to reconcile the grammar of the Quran. Can you comment on this?
Well, for the Bab, there was nothing at all irregular about the Quran. At all. He didn't notice irregularities. And the greater Islamic tradition does not countenance flaws in the Quran. It's unusual, but it's not seen as a flaw. So the Bab considered himself considered the Quran to be the perfect word of God. And what he did with it was, was to, in a sense, honor that divine status and to rearrange it and to reveal it in similar terms. But he uses the Quran, and we all know that the Bab, by these same people who were unsympathetic critics, so his Arabic was criticized because it's a very cheap accusation, easy one to make. Arabic and Persian are very different. Their grammatical structure is very different. Even the great people like Mullah Sadra dropped the ball occasionally when it came to Arabic grammar because it's very intricate and complicated. So the Bab wrote hundreds of thousands of words in Arabic with, as I said, with such mastery and skill that these hard-nosed, young, arrogant graduate students and young professors decided to give their lives to him. I don't think that they saw Arabic issues in the same way that the critics brought them up. When the Bab was at Tabriz and the court that ultimately executed him passed his death sentence. Part of that interrogation, or some of the participants were sheikhs of a rival faction, and the crown prince, right, Nasruddin Shah, was there, and all these, and so they quizzed him on some grammatical, very arcane, impossible grammatical puzzles that are well known in Arabic and so on. And his response was, "So you what the price of straw is from the maker of jewels."
Betsy asks this question: is your book, Portrait of the Prophet as a Young Artist, available? I guess that's the one you're talking about as being overpriced.
No, the book that is overpriced is Ecstasy and Intimacy and Quran Commentary. This is not a book. This is A Portrait of the Prophet as a Young Artist is a title of a talk that I gave recently at the Baha'i Studies Seminar in Oxford. And I just sort of used this slide because I think it communicates something of the artistic nature of the Bab's composition and his concerns. It's not a book. It may be an article at some point. There is an article along these lines. It's up on the Baha'i Library online called help.
Maybe it'll come later.
Yeah. Joycean elements in the Bab's Quran commentary, which I go greater depth comparing the predicament of the Bab with the predicament of James Joyce 100 years later. Because the point is basically that the Bab is on the crest of a wave of something we might consider a modernity in Iran, modernity of a new phase. Well, we know it's a new cycle, and it's another way of thinking about a transition from a traditional to a modern. Mm-hmm. It's artistic modernism that we see in the Bab's work is symbolic and expressive of this change in society and in culture. The difference between Joyce and the Bab, as I said, is that the Bab was completely ignored and hounded and ultimately executed, whereas Joyce became a celebrity in his culture.
A prophet maybe without any honor in his own land, but that's not necessarily true of literati.
That's right.
John Warner asks, could you please elaborate on Baha'u'llah as the true Joseph?
Well, I think that Baha'u'llah, first of all, in his outlawing of religious conflict or fighting in the name of religion, is a very Josephian gesture. Of all the prophets that the Quran mentions, Joseph is the one who is the promoter of peace. I mean, others do, but they also, many of them engage in battle and military action. But Joseph doesn't have any part of this of conflict, of militarism, of any of these things. So this is one element, and the veneration or the sacramental value of beauty in Baha'u'llah's writings is also another important clue to the Joseph presence in Baha'u'llah's spiritual vision and his perhaps self relation to the historical Joseph. His betrayal, of course, by his own brother is another example of a Joseph motif, and his imaginative approach to scripture, the way he interprets the Quran, and for example, in the Kitab-e-Khan, and again, the way in which he nullifies what jihad. You're familiar with the tablet of the true seeker, right? You know that the Guardian choice of the words true seeker in that tablet is a translation of the word mujahid, which is a warrior.
Warrior.
In Arabic and Persian. It is the one who practices jihad. The Baha'u'llah refers to the Shakhs Mujahid and as being one who uses spiritual qualities to fight against the injustices and the evil and the chaos of the world. And the Guardian doesn't use the word warrior in his translation. He uses the word seeker, true seeker. So to me, it seems that, and again, anytime you see in Baha'u'llah's writings reference to perfume or the scent or the garment, from the hidden words at the beginning, we've clothed this in the garment of brevity as a mercy to the God-fearing, whatever, excuse me, I can't remember anything. The idea of beauty, the blessed beauty, is a perfectly apposite Joseph reference there. There are tons of them. And a very interesting exercise for us in the court, as this short series of talks on Joseph, if in the meantime we could all go back and look through the writings, choose a favorite book, and try and track these references to Joseph and other ones. Those aren't the only three. His ability, his imagination, his ability to understand the idea of love and devotion, heartbreak between the separation, Jacob and Joseph. These are all very powerful elements in Joseph, which are brought into the faith. And also to try to imagine how the focus on Joseph and Jacob and Joseph and his brothers in the context of mid-19th century Shiism and its hatred of Sunni Muslims and so on played to his audience. This was an extremely powerful message. People were exhausted by this mutual condemnation between Sunni Muslims and Shi'i Muslims. And the vision of Joseph fits perfectly. Someone mentioned in their personal lesson plan this great book by Kenneth Cragg, I'm in the Soul. That's a beautiful book that Cragg wrote in an attempt to put in perspective the conflict between the Palestinians and the Jews. He wrote it about 10, 15, just shortly before he died, in which he sees that Joseph, the image of Joseph, is really the only way out. That both traditions venerate and admire the figure of Joseph, and they must come to some mutual understanding about how Joseph lives in both of their religious imaginations. And so you see it was no accident that the Bob chose the story of Joseph for his inaugural revelation or composition. And to do it in such a compelling and innovative, radically different artistic method was a perfect announcement of a new age.
Wow. I've still got a lot of questions here, and we've been running quite long. I can give you a few more.
All right.
Sue Emmel says, does the same kind of academic arrogance described in the time of the Bob and Jesus exist today? Can you imagine? There are insignificant, uneducated, unlettered people, including gasped women, who can speak eloquently and on par with scholars and academics today because we have access to the writings of the Bob and Baha'u'llah. Is this a form of justice in this day? Another form of fulfillment of the prophecy that all will see him?
Yes.
I think that's true. Ramez, who I believe is in New Zealand, says, I wonder if there's any reference to this story in history rather than just in Holy Scripture. Is this a figurative story or did it really happen?
Well, interesting question. In the Bob's milieu, the only real things that happened are figurative. It is, again, the idea that the imaginal realm, the realm of the spiritual imagination, is more real than what usually passes before our eyes as reality. So it's I know it sounds a little bit like I'm dodging the question, but it becomes real when it's contemplated by the human soul. That's when it really comes to life. Mm-hmm. So Joseph, I mean, we do have evidence of a Joseph-like figure with his brothers in ancient Egyptian literature, for example. Mm-hmm. The idea of brothers betraying each other is a motif in many religious scriptures. So it is a reflection, there can be no doubt. And what we know ourselves of the relationships with brothers in our own lives and families, we know that these things occur. So it is undoubtedly a very, from the point of view of your question, historically real thing. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I'm unable to say that Joseph as such represents an absolutely verifiable historical figure, but it could. We need more scholarship. This is why scholarship in the humanities and religious studies and philology is so absolutely important for the Baha'i community.
Yeah. We certainly know.
If you have the slightest interest in this kind of work, by all means, follow it.
We certainly know that Hebrews went down to Egypt because, after all, Moses had to bring them out.
That's right.
And we do know that the land of Israel has a notoriously fickle climate with lots of droughts and floods occasionally and famines.
That's
so
right.
Those elements of the story were probably familiar elements to many of the people in Canaan. And no doubt there were refugees who went down there.
Indeed. I think there's really no doubt about it, Rob and Ramirez, to try to answer your question. It would make an interesting paper, in fact, for the course.
Marco has a couple of interesting questions. He says, when will we have the full translation of the Ghayyom al-Asma? You sort of already answered that. And will we have any more translations in English of the writings of the Bab during the bicentenary?
I don't know. Hello, Marco. In Portugal, I gather.
Right, that's the Marco. You met him at Takuto.
That's right. Nice to see you again. Sorry that I didn't get to talk with you more there. Well, it's a matter of priorities. You know, individual scholars make translations of the Bab's writings all the time, and that's one thing. But then to have sort of sanctioned or official translations is another story. And I'm not aware of any, although I'm sure it's ongoing in the research department and around the scholars around the world that are preparing translations to be considered as part of a new collection from the writings of the Bab. I don't have any hard information about it. And yes, one fine day we will perhaps have a translation of the entire Qayam al-Asma. But again, it needs help. It needs work. It's a pretty daunting text, frankly. And it's not just the linguistic differences between Arabic and English, but the way in which the Bab puts it together. It's quite unprecedented.
Here's another question, switching to, if I recall right, Zambia. Malifer asks, did the Bab combine his artistic writing of the Surah of Joseph with his beautiful narration to Mullah Hussein, or did he write it later after their first meeting?
Yes. Excellent question. What is your name again?
Malifer Chiqueta.
Malifer Chiqueta. Thank you, sir. Indeed, on the night of the meeting of Mullah Hussein, the Bab composed the first chapter of the Qayam al-Asma. There are 110 other ones that were composed later. So he didn't, I mentioned the controversy or the question about, the Bab says he composed the whole thing in 40 days. So the question is, did he do this in 40 consecutive days, or did he do it in 40 days altogether over a matter of time? We know that the whole thing was completed by the following September, when some of the Letters of the Living had complete copies. Or is 40 a symbol? Most people say that 40 is not just a symbol of completion, that it was 40 days. Mm-hmm. I'd like to restate the point that in 40 years, the normal human being could not write this text because of its characteristics, its intricacy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Tamara, and the messages go on and on and on here. There's more and more and more of them. Tamara says, I understand the hem of the garment to refer to the story of Jesus and the woman with the issue of blood. Woman pulling on Jesus's.
Yes, that's one. Right. Yeah, well, true, but in the tradition of reading that we have here, these things all vibrate with each other. You cannot say that rules out all other references to textile and to garment. This idea of Joseph and his coat of many colors is a symbol of the interweaving of the warp and woof of textile, of horizontal earthly concerns meeting vertical heavenly concerns, if you will, representing a move away from the use of skins to the use of civilized methods of clothing oneself with agricultural cotton and so on, and weaving and all the rest of it. So these things are, they go on and on and on. And so I think, yes, it's not only Joseph that these things are referring to, but Joseph is in the mind of the readership of especially the Quranic Joseph and the Islamic Joseph, not just the Hebrew Joseph. These things are brought to mind. Yeah.
Well, I think we have one question left.
All right.
John asks, is Joseph's rank as the highest political figure in Egypt after the Pharaoh prophetic of Baha'u'llah's future standing as the author of a new world order?
Yes, I think that's very, very astute.
Good. Well, Malifer from Malawi corrected me and says Malawi, not Zambia. I apologize, Malifer. It says thank you. And Tamara also says thank you. And various other people have also said thank you.
Well, thank you for your patience. Yeah.
We're delighted that you were able to join us today, Todd. We're looking forward to your presentation in 2 weeks, and then another one 2 weeks after that. And we will all benefit greatly from this exploration of the biomolas moth.
Thank you, sir. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Boyd, for your patience. We'll see you next time.
Yep. So I will sign off for now. Thank you, everybody, and see you again in another few weeks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.